Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view within about 48 hours. We will follow up with an email to provide you access. Now, let me turn this over to our moderator, Mr. David Brousell, co-founder, vice president, and executive director of the Manufacturing Leadership Council.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Leslie, you can move to the next slide and you can show everybody what I look like, for better or for worse. Welcome, everyone. Let me add my welcome for today, and I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. As Lauren mentioned, I will be the host and moderator for today's session. Before we start the presentations, let's bring up our first polling question, and we will give you a few seconds to take that and then show you the result. So Leslie, please put that on the screen. So please go ahead and fill that out. And Leslie, when you are ready, if you can show the result, that would be great.
I see we still have some answers coming in, so we'll give it another few seconds.
Okay, very interesting. So we have a substantial number of people still at the starting block, some accelerating but not leading, and kind of a mixed bag here. We'll talk more about this in the Q&A session going forward. So Leslie, let's go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you, Leslie. So this webinar is a precursor to the Manufacturing Leadership Council's Rethink Conference, which runs from October 27th through 29th. The focus of Rethink this year will be on the need for manufacturing companies to accelerate their adoption of Manufacturing 4.0 in a time of unprecedented disruption, which certainly characterizes this year. At Rethink, the conversation will continue on a number of levels, including sessions with executives from Hitachi on the subject of how to orchestrate people, machines, and data to advance digital transformation, and a think tank session on digital best practices drawn from 3 World Economic Forum designated lighthouse factories, one of which we're going to hear about today. So now let me get right into our discussion on our subject of the race for digital advantage. And this is our first slide. So in the manufacturing industry, the watchword of our time has become adaptability, a competency powered by digitization. It has become clear that manufacturers that had embraced the digital model prior to the pandemic were in a far better position to adapt to rapidly changing market conditions, and in some cases, swiftly pivot production to equipment and products needed to fight the pandemic than those companies that had not embraced the model or had not embraced it strongly enough. In our survey on the effects of the pandemic on manufacturing, results of which were published in June in our Manufacturing Leadership Journal, 70% of the survey respondents say that previous levels of digitization were important to their ability to rapidly respond to the crisis, with 46% of this group, as you can see in this graph, terming that importance essential. Next slide, please, Leslie. Moreover, what has also become clear as a result of the pandemic is that the industry has arrived at an inflection point in adoption of the digital model. The importance of the digital model has become immediate and has changed forever the mindsets of those who thought it was still years away. Once companies stabilize financially and reintegrate their workforces safely into their plants and factories again, adoption of digitization, which the MLC calls Manufacturing 4.0, will accelerate as companies work to ensure they have the flexibility and speed required in a time when adaptability is not only key to surviving, but remaining competitive as well. In our June survey, 53% of respondents, as you can see on this graph, said they expect the adoption of automation and digital technologies to accelerate. In a more recent poll we've taken, this number has declined a bit, but it is still quite robust as companies tend to feel the effects of the pandemic. We still have a lot of effects of the pandemic yet to feel, so this could change again. But the three top areas of concentration are real-time data and analytics, remote monitoring and operation, and more flexible manufacturing processes. Next slide, please, Leslie. So what are the targets of the intended acceleration? The three top areas, as I mentioned, are real-time data and analytics, an increased focus on remote monitoring of operation of plant floor equipment and processes, and a greater focus on enabling more nimble and flexible manufacturing processes, exactly what you would expect in a time of unprecedented disruption. Next slide, please. And now let's turn to that essential main product that manufacturers want and need from the myriad investments in operational and information technologies that they're making: data. Not just raw data, but actionable information and insights from data that can uncover unmet needs, help make more timely and accurate business decisions, help run operations more efficiently and autonomously, anticipate and predict future conditions of equipment, and that can create the flexibility, agility, and speed that 21st century organizations need to be competitive. The message in this finding is simple yet profound. Manufacturers that become skilled at generating meaningful data about their operations, organizing that data well, extracting insights from it that they trust, and then acting on it with dispatch will not only remain in the race, but will have a more competitive future. Data mastery is as an essential competitively as in the fourth industrial revolution as electricity was in the third industrial revolution. Next slide, please. So if you see the headline there, that number on your screen is not a typo or an error. Respondents to our new study on data mastery, published just recently in our journal, expect a mind-numbing explosion of data volumes in the next couple of years, and as more and more human and physical objects become connected in their business ecosystems and generate data from everything from product usage to customer experiences to equipment utilization and more. The challenge, of course, is, so to speak, refining the crude oil, organizing data, normalizing it, analyzing it, and then having decision-making processes that can take advantage of it. But in a sign that many companies are still climbing the maturity curve on understanding the value of their data, our study also shows that apart from a general impact on operational performance, many are still trying to develop value models around their data and information assets, as you can see on the bottom right-hand part of the screen there. Next slide, Leslie. What we are seeing here is an anticipated next phase with regard to data projects, where companies want to move from such exercises as monitoring, tracing, and relatively simple diagnostics to more sophisticated optimization and predictive uses of data, and then scaling these projects in their companies. They are doing so, however, as data governance models also evolve and mature. Our study shows there is currently a diffusion of responsibility for data governance, which all organizations will have to deal with. Next slide, please, Leslie. Apart from the governance issue, how do manufacturers rate their ability to take advantage of their data assets? Only 18% of the respondents, as you can see in this graph, indicated that they are very capable of analyzing their manufacturing data. Nearly half, 47%, are still in the process of learning how to do so. Perhaps this is not unexpected, especially considering that only half have a process in place to verify the accuracy and quality of their data. But the key takeaway here from this slide is that learning really needs to accelerate given the expected explosion of data volumes. Next slide, please, Leslie. The finding here could either be called separating the wheat from the chaff or finding the needle in the haystack. Pick your favorite cliche. The issue, as this data point underscores, clearly has to do with volume and acumen, but it also may suggest a lack of clear business goal definition and alignment. The finding in this slide makes me very optimistic about manufacturers' future ability to leverage data from operations and achieve the improvements and higher level of competitiveness they want and they need. That's because although there are a bevy of challenges to data mastery evidenced in the survey, most of them are technical issues, not game-stopping cultural issues like trust. The key takeaway here from this slide is that manufacturing leadership has an affinity for data-driven decision-making. Once the technical hurdles are cleared, there's really no limit to what might be achieved. Next slide, please, Leslie. So the race for digital advantage, spurred by the pandemic, begins to accelerate. Where do companies think they are competitively right now in their journey to manufacturing 4.0? This data point suggests that the competitive field right now is quite mixed. Right now, 40% feel they are ahead of competitors to one degree or another, but only 12% feel they are substantially ahead. Those substantially ahead may be carving out sustainable competitive advantage for themselves. 34% estimate they are even with competitors, and 18% say they are behind. With that, before I bring up our next speaker, let's bring up our second polling question. Leslie, please. Okay, so what is the most important focus area for your manufacturing organization currently? Please make your selection, and then we'll show you the response.
All right, we'll give our participants a few more seconds to get their responses in. They are still coming in. All right, let's close it up.
Okay, interesting result here. Steady focus on outcomes is doing very well. It's good. It means people were dealing with the pandemic, but also keeping their eye on the ball, so to speak, with regard to their future performance and competitiveness. Rethinking new technologies is also quite strong. We'll discuss this more at the end. So right now, I'm very pleased to turn it over to one of our trusted partners and frequent collaborators, Kevin from IDC, Kevin Prouty from IDC. Kevin, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. That was a pretty cool presentation. It validates a lot of the data we've picked up as well. So from a standpoint of, you can go to the next slide. I think they'll see enough of me today. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of operations and IT, and a lot of people talk about IT-OT convergence, but I think it's really interesting to look at the perspective from an IT executive and in some cases ops executives. You can see here, I'm not going to read through these. You'll get copies of the presentation, but really what comes out of this, I think, is that central one at the top. IT is concerned about being marginalized. Operations feels that IT isn't supporting their innovation, that they're spending money in other places when they should be supporting innovation on the plant floor or in operations, not just the plant floor. And the biggest issue both of them have together, beyond some cybersecurity and networking issues, around data management. You can move to the next slide, please. And all this ties into what we call the Industry 4.0 continuum. This is about the big steps that companies have to take to get where they want to go with Industry 4.0. And that Industry 4.0 goal is to basically have this very agile, very flexible operation that can quickly adapt to changing market and internal needs. The first step we usually look at is what we call digitize, which is pretty straightforward. It's basically taking your assets and your processes, getting them connected, and getting access to the data. The next step is monitor. It's actually consuming some of that data to see how your assets and processes are operating. And then the really big step, this is really where there's a big tipping point. This is the diagnose part. This is where you start seeing things like AI, machine learning, advanced analytics with things like pattern recognition and stuff like that, where you're starting to not just look at what's going on, but actually start to develop an automated continuous improvement program. Then the next step is control, and that is, can you feed back into the system? Can you feed back into your process to make adjustments on individual assets and individual processes? And of course, the last step is kind of the nirvana piece of it, and that is autonomous operation. Can you turn your operation over as an orchestrated network of assets and processes that will run on its own, make its own decisions, maybe with some human interaction here and there to guide it to where it needs to go, to bring changes into the system? But it's this digitize, monitor, diagnose, control, and autonomous operation. That's the continuum we see at IDC. Next slide, please. And this brings up the IT-OT convergence aspect. So I built this particular slide because we were getting this question: what's IT versus what's OT? What is operations doing? Why do they need all this technology? Why is it starting to rub against IT? And frankly, I've been in operations for a long time. There's always been this rub between IT and OT. Where's it start? Where's it stop? Now we're getting to a point where we're formally defining it. And you have IT working on infrastructure, the back office applications, overall cybersecurity, lending a lot of support to data governance and the transactional systems, so forth and so on. Then OT, much more real-time process, safety-oriented, operational automation, physical device connectivity. I talked about the digitization, things like process historians, asset instrumentation, just a general operational apps, as well as the operational excellence and continuous improvement aspect to it all. But in between, where there's some push and pull, this is what we call IT-OT convergence, and we have a term we call digital engineering. That's from edge to physical. It's the operational and asset performance management, things like resilient operations, operational data management, something called model lifecycle management. It's these areas that are in between what you'd consider the line of business, or I'm sorry, the business managers and the operations people. Next slide, please. So this digital engineering concept we have is really around providing a resilient decision-making framework. And that is that, today we have a lot of middle managers in operations, from when you take information at the point of activity and it goes through several layers of middle management until it gets to a senior manager who has to make a strategic or operational decision. And in those translations that happen in between, sometimes the information is outdated. It's the wrong information. There's some bias assigned to that information based on all those layers of middle management. And then the opposite happens, coming back down once a decision is made to get to the point of activity, and an operator in the shop floor or a machine has to perform an action. And to kind of cut around all that, there's all this, David's presentation talked about this, the amount of data that's being generated is getting to the point it's beyond a human being's capability to rapidly draw insight from it. So the digital engineering organization is built to ingest all that data, provide a framework around it, provide the support to the AI and robotics that will manage that data and analyze it, and present a decision framework, what we call a resilient decision-making framework, to the senior decision makers. But that digital engineering piece, whatever you call it, we have a number of our clients right now that are building things like converged IT-OT operations organizations, operational organizations. We have some people actually calling it digital engineering. We have people calling it collaborative production operations centers or operations performance centers. They're calling it different things, but it's really this digital engineering thing. One of their key components is managing the data And it's also managing all those models that are being built for AI and for advanced analytics, because when you build all those models out, let's say the engineer who helped you build it retires, moves on to another job, all of a sudden that model starts to get stale because no one's paying attention to it. That's digital engineering's job, is to manage that. And now when we look at where it goes in the organization, it starts out coordinated. That is, it's a matrixed organization. You have IT, subject or domain experts, subject matter experts or domain experts, all working together. You might have OEMs in there. You might have even some third parties doing some managed services around remote monitoring diagnostics. And they're all kind of grouped into this digital engineering group. They have a matrix reporting structure to ops and IT. Then you move into a collaborative organization where you have the SMEs starting to become digital engineers. You have some of that middle management level starting to drop into digital engineering. You still have IT support, but that IT support now reports into digital engineering, which reports up into operations. And then when you finally get truly converged, you have a full digital engineering organization staffed with digital engineers. There's still OEMs in there. There's still third-party service providers being managed in there. They have a dotted line to IT because they still need to support things like data governance, network management from IT's perspective, and cybersecurity. That's one of the key concepts here, is when you start to converge all this stuff, you end up with one solid cybersecurity strategy and plan. But the short of it is, there is a maturity that happens as you start work, as these IT and subject matter experts work together in a loose kind of organization, maybe not even a full-blown standalone organization yet. Then it moves into a full digital engineering organization that has dual reporting, and then it moves into where it's really just an operations group that has this digital capability. Next slide, please. So just to kind of go over this a little bit, and this is a key concept for us in the future of operations. I'm going to come back to a comment that David made about in part of the MLC study. The amount of data that is being generated and will be generated is just, it's almost unbelievable how much data is going to be generated. We have a nice study in a report we did, very similar to David's, where it talks about the amount of data is in the next 5 years, starting in 2019 to 2025, is going to increase by a factor of 3 in some industries and by a factor of 10 in some industries like semiconductor. So you need these digital engineering organizations. But the other key concept here is this rapid resilient decision making is going to allow companies, especially manufacturing companies, to better align with their markets. As markets are being driven, they're shifting, it's volatile as we come into the recovery out of the pandemic, you have to be able to move very quickly, and you have to be able to analyze all this data you're collecting very quickly. So part of this whole resilient decision-making framework is about making your operation more tightly aligned with your market. That digital engineering organization is the bridge in that digital gap in operations, and it will be a big part in fixing, or at least addressing, this data dilemma. Next slide, please. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, Kevin. Much food for thought there. We're going to come back to it, I'm sure, during the Q&A session. So before we go to our next speaker, who is Sath Rao from Hitachi Vantara, let's take a look at our third and final polling question, Leslie. Okay. The next question is, what is most critical for your organization in order to be better prepared for the future of operations? Please take a few seconds and give us your choice, and then we'll show the result.
And David, while our participants are answering that poll, I would like to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please do enter them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will address them during the Q&A.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. The most significant response was around organizational vision, roadmap, and change leadership. Very interesting. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this more in the Q&A session. So now I would like to introduce Sath Rao from Hitachi Vantara, who will give us his viewpoint on the race for digital advantage. Sath?
Thank you, David, and thanks, Kevin, for the great lead in, great insight. So kind of continuing the story, and in fair disclosure, David has warned me that he has a sledgehammer handy, which he's going to drop on my toe if I don't stick to my time. So I'll go through some of these slides real quickly, but hopefully we'll give you a flavor, and the downloads will actually provide you access to more detailed insights that you can peruse. The topic of today's session was around the race for digital advantage. And really, when you look at 2020, there's been reference made about the great manufacturing reset. And then let's try to understand what this is all about. But to get started with, Hitachi has about 110 years of OT experience, and Hitachi Vantara has about 60 years of IT experience. So together, the organizations are able to, develop and provide insights to our customers, both on the IT OT side of the business. And I think that's a pretty, very unique, claim to fame. What you also see on the left-hand side are several, detailed statistics about Hitachi being a global powerhouse in manufacturing. A lot of manufacturing sites and facilities around the globe. And early this year, Hitachi's Omika Works actually received the Lighthouse designation from the World Economic Forum. I have presented to the MLC on earlier occasions about our journey, and really this was a journey in the making, almost 5 years long. So if you really look, you don't end up looking at getting a Lighthouse status as a culmination of a race, but a continuing of a journey. But this journey started almost 5 years ago. And as you see from some of the areas that we focused on, clearly there were a lot of areas that we focused incrementally, step by step, till we felt we were really ready to take on the challenge of getting a third-party audit and reviewing all our achievements, etc. But there are lots of these benefits. This factory is typically a low volume, high mix, discrete manufacturing focused on controls and automation. But what is interesting is that some of these lessons apply universally to several of our industries, and the lessons are actually built into our solution cores, which we then are able to offer to some of our clients in terms of helping them accelerate their intelligent manufacturing maturity journeys by performing an assessment all the way from level 1 to level 4. And in some of the earlier surveys and polls, we got insights on where today's audiences are, somewhere in level 1, somewhere between level 2 and 3, and a very few in that level 4, which are kind of gaining the competitive advantage and trying to accelerate. But wherever you are in this journey, the ability to take stock and figure out what to do next becomes extremely important. And immediately after the pandemic, we ran a survey of manufacturing audiences, and I'll share some very interesting insights. But a resounding feedback was that this was a manufacturing reset, especially after you started looking at the post-pandemic reactions, or at least, by post-pandemic, I mean, after the initial alarm, if you will. And clearly all the components of a reset, in the sense of whatever you were doing before now had to be viewed in a different light, became very visible. And clearly all the way from, scaling digital to kind of focusing on resilience, and the very innovation process in the manufacturing shop floor, and the value of data, like David was also mentioning, and how innovation became distributed. And there was one message that even Kevin was articulating, is like the CIOs were telling their organizations that stay out of the way of folks who are innovating. Let's enable the innovation process. And the strength of the innovation is not just in what you are doing, but what can you achieve together with a larger part of the ecosystem. What we have done in the next few slides, and I'll guide you through this, is that specifically for those who are 100 million and greater, and therefore had a little bit more of flexibility, they were using technology. But clearly after the reset, when we went back and asked them saying, hey, how are you looking at future investments? You'll see very clearly the focus was on predictive capabilities, the ability to look ahead, use machine learning and using automation and robotics, but at the same time also building the AI ML muscle in your organization. The same slide in a different way, kind of trying to help you prioritize some of the key investment focus areas. You'll see that what people were saying was, yes, in the next 1 to 2 years, they'll definitely focus more on automation and robotics. That will continue to increase. That was definitely a planned area of investments. But also what was interesting was people realizing that with this humongous amount of data that's being generated, it was very important to transform into a learning organization, and how you could use AI and ML to actually help accelerate, develop some of these use cases and generate insights. The third portion, and then just tying back to the recently concluded poll, in terms of looking at the anatomy of change and looking at the top challenge for digital industrial transformation, people came back and said, really, their biggest challenge was on items fund change and win change. And what clearly means is that organizations are grappling with the need to kind of figure out budget sources, figuring out something different from the traditional stop and go approaches. And then the biggest thing was the last item here, which is how do you win with change? Do you have a roadmap of transformative outcomes that you can fully leverage to achieve the vision of manufacturing 4.0? And when you tie this back to the theme of the manufacturing leadership event this year, which is kind of rethink, data is greater than opinion, and really all of us need to kind of take a step back and kind of try to understand, and what does this win with change mean? Do we have a roadmap? And I think one of the polls suggested that people are still trying to look at technology and trying to figure out, hey, how can we create transformative advantages? Is it just what's off the shelf, or are we using transformative technology to come up with absolutely new use cases? And I think that's what the race to digital is about. Now, when you take the same cut of data, but then try to segment it for less than 100 million, which is the real small companies out there, clearly they were looking at wireless, cloud, and various parts of these issues. But what's interesting is the bottommost line that you see here, which is people coming back and saying, really, in the short term, yes, we think we have focus, but as you start looking into the 3 to 5 year and 6 to 10 years and beyond, we are not sure. We don't know what we're going to do. And that goes back to that roadmap process, saying that, look, it's not just about the technology piece. You also need to know the whys behind what you're doing, and more importantly, the know what in terms of the right use cases. And I think what this basically means is that while people are realizing, and as you'll see, they know that, hey, with this amount of data, if they're connected, AI and ML will definitely hold a huge promise in the future. But how do you get from point A to point B? And incrementally, if you go back to that intelligent manufacturing maturity assessment, from level 1 to level 4, how do you get there? There seems to be a lack of imagination, and therefore I think the need for us to collectively reinvent. And how can we go about this reinvention process? This is kind of going back to that earlier slide of greater than 100 million. They also were like, the number one challenge was, hey, need a roadmap, and clearly that continues to be a challenge for the smaller ones. But I think the need to focus on the key areas that need to change. The routine drives out the important, as they say, when you're kind of you're running your operations on a day-to-day basis. And so how do you pick and choose between these run and transform cycles? Run for the short haul, and then transform for the long haul. So trying to summarize, you'll see here that, the classic stories about David and Goliath, really the chasms are widening, and the moats are becoming narrower in this race for digital advantage. And clearly, while the divide is getting deeper and wider, digital also is a huge equalizer. This can actually enable the smaller companies, the medium-sized companies, to compete with the larger companies. Therefore, it becomes important to select, the right event, if you will, in this race. Develop the right capabilities. Are you running a marathon? Are you running, a 400-meter, race? And therefore, build the right kind, and based on your business objectives, build the right kind of use cases that move your needle. And therefore, when we look at lighthouse manufacturers, we also went through the same process of prioritizing some of these use cases in that 5-year transformation journey, picking what was important, what were not necessarily always low-hanging fruits, but the ability to take the right decision and then working together, the fact that we can do more. And by that, what it means is leveraging the power of the ecosystem as well. And if you look at some of these hyperscalers, they are actually working with, folks in the automotive industry and providing certain repeatable solutions. And how can that be leveraged? How can AI and ML also be leveraged, even if you're small to medium-sized companies? And clearly, the realization that, be it traction for use cases, be it, talent for this, new age after the reset, be it training for, your employees, everything is digital. And I think that's the big realization. And then as part of the rethink activities, I think it's going to be important to kind of take a step back, see how, some of your other peer members are taking these advantages. Incidentally, Hitachi Vantara also has a couple of clients who do belong to this, middle, not necessarily always the large companies, but who are taking the learnings from their ecosystem and from their partners and actually getting great results. So there's still hope. With that, back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Sath. I think we are now moving into our Q&A portion of the webinar. Audience members, if you have questions, please put them in the question area of the control panel on your right-hand side of your screen. We can also take them verbally if Leslie wants to unmute the audience. But let's get your reactions to the Kevin and Sath, to the poll questions that we asked. Perhaps we should show the audience once again what the results of those were. Leslie, can we do that?
We sure can. I'm going to bring up the first question. If anybody has a question that they would like to ask aloud, please do raise your hand and we will unmute you individually.
Okay, this was our first poll question, and the question was, from your company's perspective, where is your company currently positioned in the race for digital advantage? We see the results. A good portion saying they're accelerating but not leading. Smaller portion saying they're ahead of others and gaining momentum. Sath and Kevin, what's your reaction to the result? Did this pretty much fall into what you thought, or is it a bit of a surprise that
it actually
don't feel more competitive?
I'm sorry, it actually aligns with some of the, this is Kevin, aligns with some of the stuff we see as well. And I think part of the reason it looks like it's just a mess of people in all different maturity levels is there's also a lot of silos involved. So you might be in a silo that is doing well, but the rest of your company is not, or vice versa. So I think a lot of it has to do with how the communication is working in your company. We see a lot of really good things happening in most companies, but again, it's a matter of, is it company-wide? Is it focused on one function? Maybe focused on one location? So I think that also breaks down a lot of this.
Yeah, there's a considerable response here. So it's still on the starting block. could this reflect the fact that there are a number of companies out there that have involved in or still involved in doing pilot projects around digital, but haven't figured out how to scale them? Sath, what's your view on that?
Yes, David. So, I think I agree with Kevin as well, but I think, going back to that one of the earlier slides I used, which was, the great reset moment. And quite often the reset moment is not necessarily only a realization that, oh boy, something happened and we need to now, do something different. It doesn't mean throwing out all the learnings from the past, but clearly it does, it's easy to say, yeah, you can figure out ways to fund your digital industrial transformation journey. But quite often funding is a challenge, and we saw that, especially for the small companies, they're really, and even for the medium to large, especially when you're seeing your demand kind of, fluctuate. But go back to a recent webinar that we did, and we had two of our customers. One was from, an industry which actually saw an uptick in production because of the pandemic. But the other one was in the oil and gas industry, and what was interesting was their industry saw huge decimation. But the CTO who was with us basically talked about how their digital revenues doubled in half a year, and how they were basically providing services to their customers to actually look at uptime, production, working with humans, machines, and data. And then really, they were still hiring where other divisions were actually getting decimated. So I think irrespective of where you are, I think it's important to get off the starting block, look at new ideas. But yes, it's not uncommon for people to be caught up in this "what do we do" mode.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. We did have a question come in over the Q&A function. So let me stop for a moment on revisiting the poll questions and take this question directly. And this comes based on something you had mentioned and talked about quite a lot, Kevin. And the question is, when migrating to a digital engineering organization, which persons are more likely to become digital engineers, manufacturing or IT staff?
Well, I think what we've seen, so I'm going to give you two answers to that. One is what I think should happen, and one is what I think is typically happening. What's typically happening is they're putting an IT person. In fact, there's one company I work with, a large chemical company, has taken one of their senior IT leaders and put them in charge of, not only in charge of the digital engineering organization, but they report into operations. And sometimes it's a dependency on around what the main goal is. They have a very heavy short-term goal of implementing a very large enterprise-wide data historian, but there's also a cybersecurity issue as well. So that brings IT in. What I've typically seen, though, and I think is probably a more common approach, and in some ways a better approach, is take a senior operations person and who has a little bit of a technical background, and they go and they start pulling in IT. But you got to be careful, because that person has to have the right mandate. That person's mandate should not be just to make operations or just create a manufacturing IT organization. It has to be a digital organization. And I actually feel that some of those, the technical staff on the operations side, have more true digital skills than IT does. But I'm not completely discounting IT. IT has some really good people there as well, and you're going to need them for networking, cybersecurity, a lot of the data governance issues. So in the end, I think you need to start building it around operations digital technology, but you have to have the IT people in there as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I see a number of questions have also come into the functional area on the site, but I'm having a little trouble seeing them. Leslie, could you take the next question and state what it is?
Sure, David, let me pull them up. This one is for Sath. With predictive analytics as a large percent over 3 to 5 years, why would cloud not be more prioritized, assuming that you need cloud for data analytics?
Good question. Again, I think if you go back and whoever asked the question, when you access the downloaded documents, and we can speak to you again offline, but the first column was, what are you currently using? And they did say yes, they are using cloud, and they plan on continuing and perhaps accelerating use of cloud. And then based on where you are, based on preferences, I know not everyone is moving to the cloud. There are very strong reasons, especially after this great reset, but people want to kind of start learning and doing it on-prem, and then increasingly kind of moving to the cloud as well. So it doesn't mean that they have said they don't want to go to the cloud. They do, but at the same time, based on their position in their intelligent manufacturing journey, they could be somewhere between level 2 and level 3. And quite often, when we share that slide with our customers, they come back and say, we have 3 functions, and for one of these, we are at level 2.1. The other 2, we are at level 2.4 and 2.5, right? And it's their way of saying that, look, not all use cases can be clubbed and put in a common box because you're working with OEMs, etc. But having said that, increasingly, we've also seen OEMs come back to us and saying, you know what, we want to offer these new services to our customers. And in fact, later on at Rethink, one of our senior execs from Europe will actually share some of these ideas in the think tank, wherein we kind of talk about these leading ideas. Some of them are taken from lighthouse manufacturers, but innovation comes from all shapes and sizes and in directions. And so people are innovating, and there'll be some great examples that we can investigate deeper during Rethink.
Yeah, David, can I make
Kevin,
a quick
you have a perspective on this cloud question too?
Yeah, so I have two famous quotes in the DX world, and one of them is, you can't have a cloud strategy without an edge strategy. So, and what I mean by that is you have to have figured out the data piece on the back end of, I should say the front end of it. And that's where I think what Seth's talking about, when you start getting into the analytics piece, there's already a lot of analytics going on in operations. You see it in process optimization, you see it in quality management. So one of the key things is, and this leads to my second famous saying, and that is, every engineer is a data silo of one. And all those engineers have all that data, and they're probably doing local analysis, maybe even single analysis on it. So the key aspect there is to get off, this is where I talk about data governance all the time. That is, this digital engineering organization needs to get a handle and put a box around a lot of that data to make sure everyone has access to it. And one of the best ways to do that is get it up into the cloud. But just getting it into the cloud is only a starting point, because then you still need to manage how it's used and how it's all tied together. That's what all I had to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Leslie, next question. Leslie, you still there?
I think Leslie's having some computer issues, so I will read off the next question here.
Okay, well, thanks.
No problem. So let's see what we have here. When do you think this tipping point will change?
And I presume the questioner is asking this about the reset, about the old experience we've gone through this year with the pandemic and the inflection point that we talked about. This is actually a very interesting question, whether this has a long tail, or whether things are going to kind of go back to the way they were after we get a vaccine and et cetera. Kevin, what do you think?
So I think we're already past the tipping point. When we talk, we did a survey recently about, what's 1 year going to look like. This is back in August. What's it going to look like 1 year and 2 years out? And 1 year out, we still had a number of manufacturing CEOs saying that 50% of their workforce is going to stay remote. Even 2 years out, they're expecting 30% to stay remote. So I think we're already past that point, because and the next step beyond working remote is a little bit more of this autonomous operation. And again, we're already starting to see that accelerate. We're starting to see, I work with another large manufacturing company. I work with their head of engineering, and he stated that his engineers are on rotating shifts, and probably will be for the next 2 years, 2 days on site, 3 days off. And they're on call as well. but he expects that to remain like that. In fact, he expects at some point that some of the stuff they're doing will be automated, and so that they won't even need those engineers on site or off site anymore, and they'll be transitioned to other positions. And that's this whole compression of middle management in engineering and in operations. So I think we're past that tipping point, and we're never going to go back, or at least probably in my career, we'll probably never go back to the way it was, using air quotes.
Yeah, a permanent fork in the road. Sath, any perspective on that, or should we move to our next question?
No, I think I agree broadly with Kevin, and you know, when you look at a reset, it's basically changing, you know, certain fundamental paradigms. And you know, we've revisited this so many times, David, at several of these MLC summits, right? And it was like, you know, generally slow, you know, change and things like that. But now, you know, I think that second point which I talked about, which is, you know, a cultural shift in terms of data-driven democratization of insights, suddenly becomes a huge enabler. Because now, you know, information in the hands of everyone, including the operator, provides them an opportunity to, you know, take corrective action and preventive action, and then see why, you know, the power of information. And I think that in itself will accelerate, you know, and then I think there are in several of these articles that we have published in the journal, there are stories about, you know, people coming back and saying, oh yeah, you know, we saw in two months what would have taken 2 years, you know, not just in manufacturing, even in healthcare. You know, look at how, you know, Teladoc and some of these other companies have basically changed paradigms.
Yeah, so this reset, this inflection point we've been talking about, this permanent fork in the road that Kevin has been just talked about, do you both feel that this will be uniformly experienced across the manufacturing industry by large, medium, and small manufacturers as a group? Or Kevin, you've talked about this potential for a digital divide. How do the small manufacturers, how are they going to fare here? Could you address that question?
Sure. I think the small manufacturers, there's in some ways have an advantage, in some ways a disadvantage. The advantage is a lot of them don't have the legacy infrastructure they have to deal with, and they don't have the technical debt. So they're almost starting from a clean slate. So all the cloud-based applications, cloud connectivity, remote collaboration isn't as big of a cultural hurdle as it is in some of the larger organizations. Of course, I think their biggest disadvantage is in some ways they don't have the internal digital expertise and capabilities. That can be worked around through third parties, and I think different organizations that are coming together to help them. So I think in the end, they probably have a slight advantage over larger organizations. The big advantage of larger organizations, they already have some of this infrastructure in place, so they can work with it, but they're going to have to replace some of it. And I also think there's a massive change management project that has to go on around middle management and how middle management manages data, how they manage decision making, and how resilient the middle management organization really is. So I think in that aspect, larger companies probably have some disadvantages.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, yeah, for sure. Lauren, do we have any further questions in our question?
We certainly do. We have time for, I'd say, one more, and then there's some that we'll be able to follow up with post-event. So let's go with the question: in many manufacturing companies, scaling fast from pilots to multiple deployments seems to be a big challenge. Any thoughts or recommendations?
Yeah, Kevin, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics because we call it death by pilots or proof of concepts. I always tell our clients when they're piloting something, especially around analytics, operational data, or digital engineering, pilot it as if it's going to become enterprise-wide. And what I mean by that is look at the data. How is the data going to be governed? How is it going to be accessed? Who has the responsibility for managing that data? If you can't answer those questions or configure it as if it was an enterprise, or at least to see the end game as if this was an enterprise-wide project, that pilot at best is going to be successful in a very local way, and at worst you won't be able to scale it even within your own organization. So you don't just do pilots because a technology vendor comes in and says, oh, here's a cool little pilot you can run. Won't cost you much money, because you're wasting your very valuable resources on that pilot with no end game in mind, is how am I going to scale this out to really draw value?
Okay, Sath, any perspective on this too? The pilot purgatory question that we've dealt with for quite a while?
Yes, and I'll try to share. I think we have some couple of backup slides, but I'll try to keep my response real short. And I think the story was, what are some of the lessons from, the World Economic Forum lighthouse factories, right? And if you, Leslie, if maybe you can forward to, for whatever reasons, the cursor doesn't seem to work on my end, but the story is that, as you start looking at some of these lighthouse factories, they have improvements in KPI all across the range, right? From the short to the 400, 700% improvements, etc. And basically, in that, what we are able to see is that it's very important to measure what matters. And therefore, whatever is the storyline for your large or small manufacturing organizations, you need to kind of focus on the pain points, which will eventually be needle movers for your business, and therefore prioritizing that pain and instituting a culture, if you will, wherein you are democratizing the cure, right? Making it available across the organizations for people to kind of drive change. That becomes a big takeaway. The second one is like Kevin was mentioning, hey, you need to prioritize, right? And your run and transform cycles, and pivot for the future. Large companies, I think there was an interesting anecdote from I think the Undersecretary for Air Force Procurement, Will Rogers, and he basically said that, look, when you look at some of these, there's a concept called NGAD, which is next generation air dominance, and they are coming up with these budgetary ideas on how much defense is being spent on aerospace and old equipment, right? 70% of funds are being spent on maintaining old equipment, and therefore you're just not nimble enough to the point that Kevin was making about digital engineering and how you're able to move forward. And therefore, these small organizations can actually move very quickly, right? And I think in the next slide, Leslie, you'll actually see that in this need for pivoting for the future, some of the smaller companies have actually done remarkable, produced next generation aircrafts in less time than what the large predecessors actually have. And therefore, focusing on operations and the concept around digital engineering becomes extremely important. And therefore, when you pivot for the future, some of these small organizations need to build stamina, right? And the AI muscle, if you will. And in the next slide, I think the short story is that develop your own success roadmap. What will move the needle for your organization? What do you need to do differently? And plan for the domino. And then by that, what I mean is several of these cascading use cases, which create that lasting impact. And basically, and how do you do that? You do that by grassrooting the change, which is provide that data insights to everyone in the organization, beyond your organization, into your extended supply chain as well. And suddenly, the power of working together becomes phenomenal.
All right, thank you very much for that. We are at the top of the hour. I want to respect everybody's time. We did start 2 minutes after, so we're kind of on time here. Hitachi has provided additional resources, as you can see on the screen. I think we're going to see this right now. The link to access these are in the chat box if you'd like to take advantage of them. And we will be sending the link in a follow-up email. Finally, as I mentioned at the outset of this, our Rethink conference is in 2 weeks' time. A lot of the content is going to focus on this digital transformation issue that we're all grappling with. So please, if you haven't registered for Rethink, do so. We'd love to see you there. And we will continue the conversation October 27th through 29th. I'm David Brousell. I want to thank Kevin Prouty of IDC and Sath Rao of Hitachi Vantara for participating today. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you on future MLC webinars. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, David. Sath, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.